For me, this is an absolute thrill. When I was a boy, my favorite uncle taught me an expression that he used frequently in jest, but it's a really nice sentiment. He used to say, "You're a gentleman and a scholar and a man for all seasons." And I didn't know exactly what all that meant, but if I know one person who embodies being a gentleman and a scholar and a man for all seasons, it's our featured speaker this evening. Paul A. Sukup, S.J., has explored the connections between communication and theology since 1982. His publications include Communication and Theology, Christian Communication, a bibliographical survey, sorry about that, Media, Culture, and Catholicism, Mass Media and the Moral Imagination with Philip J. Rossi, and Fidelity in Translation, Communicating the Bible in New Media with Robert Hodgson. This latter publication grows out of his work on the American Bible Society's New Media Bible. In addition, he and Thomas J. Farrell have edited 4 volumes of the collected works of Walter J. Ong, S.J., Faith and Contexts. These volumes have led him to examine more closely how orality literacy studies can contribute to an understanding of theological expression. Most recently, he has published a book of biblical meditations on communication, Out of Eden, 7 Ways God Restores Blocked Communication, and edited a collection of essays applying Ong's thought of Ong and media ecology, essays in communication, composition, and literary studies. A graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, Sukup holds the Pedro Arrupe S.J. University Endowed Professorship and teaches in the Communication Department at Santa Clara University. Father Sukup has served on the Board of Trustees of the American Bible Society and Loyola University of New Orleans, on the Communication Committee of the U.S. Catholic Conference, and holds membership in the Religious Communication Association, the National Communication Association, and the Media Ecology Association. And if I may say, he has served us admirably for a very long time as our treasurer, and I don't know if we could do any of this without him. He's truly, truly indispensable. He's a gentleman, a scholar, and a man for all seasons, as I've said, and he's going to deliver a speech tonight called Finding Ong's Way Through, Walter Ong's Method for Media Ecology. I ask you to give a warm welcome to Paul Sukup.
Thank you very much. When I told my good friend and former department chair, Emil McEnany, that the Media Ecology Association had honored me with the Walter Ong Award, Emil surprised me by saying, "Did I ever tell you that I was Walter Ong's research assistant?"
Wow.
No, he had never said that. He also mentioned to me that Emil himself was from Kansas City, where Walter Ong grew up, and their families knew each other. That may be how he got the job as the research assistant, because his aunt was very good friends with Mrs. Ong. But Emil was there at St. Louis University, and I said, "Well, what was it like to be Ong's research assistant?" He laughed and he says, "You know, when I was a student there, St. Louis University had just acquired a microfilm copy of the entire Vatican Library. And Ong told him, go and look around and find something interesting." For those of you who have research assistants, you might think of that as a challenge for them. Now, that actually seems quite typical of Walter Ong. Many years later, when I enrolled in a graduate class with him, at the time I was an undergraduate, senior undergraduate at St. Louis University. If you were close to graduation, you could take one course in the graduate school. So I signed up with Walter Ong. And that particular course was on agonistic contests, or contest in education, why debate was built so much into educational systems. And he wanted to explore that. Now, Ong himself, you may remember, did a lot of work about Peter Ramus, the scholar, educational reformer in Paris in the early 16th century. And so Ong was very attuned to the kind of educational patterns, and he wanted to push it back a little bit. And so he assigned different members of our graduate program, people to look at. So I got John of Salisbury. John of Salisbury was a 12th century secretary and friend of Thomas of Becket. You may know that story of murder in the cathedral and all of those kinds of things like that. And as I was told to find the writings of Thomas of Becket and look for something interesting, I ended up noticing there was a very strong polemic tradition in Becket. Partly not in Becket, but in Salisbury, because Salisbury was defending his boss, Thomas of Becket, against the civil powers in England at the time. You remember, King Henry eventually had Becket murdered in the cathedral as part of these disputes, but Salisbury became his apologist. And I noticed there was a very strong tradition of that sort of contestation in rhetoric. And eventually I was able to connect it to Richard Gregg's article about the rhetoric of protest, written by Gregg in the early 1970s. You guys had asked me to do this talk. I dug through my files, and sure enough, I had not thrown away that paper. And I reread it. And I thought, this wasn't bad. Kind of looking at the rhetoric of protest from the 12th century and how it kind of defines how people dealt with one another and how the educational system prepared people for this. So once again, Walter Ronald's going to go find something interesting. It did pay off in a way for me. It also says something about the way Walter thought. In an early essay called System, Space, and Intellect in Renaissance Symbolism, he comments on this idea of a method. Now that book or that essay comes out just before his major works on Ramus, but it's based in many of the same kind of research traditions. He had argued in the essay as well as in the Ramus books that he found different ways of knowing in Greek and Hebrew culture, citing the Greeks as being more visually oriented in their sense of knowing, while the Hebrews were more attuned to auditory methods. He develops these in much more detail in the Ramus books, but in the course of the paper, he makes a passing comment about method. And he does an etymology of it. And he says method, of course, is from two Greek words, meta and hodos. Meta means through, has many different meanings, but one of them means through. Hodos is a road. And so a method literally is a way through, a road through something. And On seemed to find that as the characteristic way of knowledge, not only in Greek culture, but later on as well, to find our way through some body of knowledge. I mean, it's basically what Emil McInerney called find something interesting. When you're in the middle of a kind of forest, whether it's a forest of ideas or a forest of facts or a forest of anything, you need to find your way through it. Now, in Western thought, and that's all I'll claim because that's what I know, there have been several transformations in how people think about knowledge and what counts as knowledge. And I don't mean at all to look into the epistemological foundations of these sorts of things, but rather just how people manage information. Because really, that's what we're all trying to do. We're confronted with some body of whatever it is, and we need to manage that information because we can't simply leave it random. And so On begins his career charting one moment of change in information management. And that was in the 16th century. And of course, it is highly influenced by the printing press 100 years before. And On becomes very attuned to that sense of what he called the Greek and the Hebrews' ways of knowing and understanding. Later, he began to speak instead about oral and literate cultures. Because the Greek-Hebrew distinction doesn't really work. Both of them knew writing. Both of them had oral elements to them. So it wasn't so much a difference between a Greek and a heated culture, but as a type of information management based in sound and a type of information management based on seeing. Now, these kinds of changes happen with some regularity in the West. Mediacology might be interested in looking at how different technologies can play a role in that. Eric Pearl has a book called Sacred Channels, just was translated in this last year or so. But he argues for a similar change occurring in the 19th century, which is a move towards abstraction. And he looks at how, in the West at least, we've left behind all the visualist models that we had coming from Greek culture and through the Renaissance and in print culture. And he highlights things like the development of symbolic logic, a logic that doesn't depend on particular things, but just on symbolism. He connects that to the development of non-Euclidean geometry, which again moves away from concrete visual places, and even into post-Newtonian physics, which again is so based on symbolism and mathematics that we hardly recognize our world in it. And so we have these changes of how we deal with knowledge and information. Ong explores that, and he looks at how to find a way through these particular kinds of things, his idea of a method. Because the challenge for human knowledge is not just to have confidence in what we know, but to remember how we got there and to be able to recall our way through that. Western culture, at least until the time of Aristotle, had anchored its knowledge in certain kinds of principles, and we try to recognize them, whether they're visual or oral. So Ong talks about 5 different kinds of managing information in the course of his studies. He doesn't do these chronologically because he sort of started in the middle, in the Renaissance, post-Renaissance, and then he began looking back and looking forward. So the first is what he calls, he mentions this in the book Orality and Literacy, a verbo-motor culture. Another French Jesuit anthropologist, Marcel Mauss, may have been the one who introduced Ong to that. Mauss was a student of ancient and contemporary oral cultures as an anthropologist. In one of these kind of fascinating things to me, while Ong was in Paris, and Ong spent 3 years or 4 years in Paris doing the research on his, Raymond's books, because he had literally, the students here couldn't imagine this kind of a world. There was no internet. If you wanted a book, in many times, you had to go to the library, and that might have been a library in Paris, or in Berlin, or in London. And that's what Ong was doing, trying to trace the bibliographic tradition of Peter Raymond. And he spent 3 years doing that and finding the different books in which he developed his thought. But while he was there in Paris, Marcel Mauss was also in Paris, teaching at the University of Paris his courses on anthropology. And at least at that time in the early 50s, Mauss would have kind of ranked up there with Ludwig Strauss and some of the other well-known French anthropologists. I don't know, I haven't been able to track this down. They may have lived at the same Jesuit community. I do know that Ong lived in the same Jesuit community with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Could you imagine the dinner table conversations if you had Mauss and Teilhard and Ong sitting? Of course, they might have been talking about football. But just the fact that these ideas are sort of floating around the table. Now, in his field work, Mauss had worked in the Middle East. But he also grew up in a French peasant society, which he said was not all that different from the societies that he studied when he was in the Middle East. And he characterized their way of knowledge as verbo-motor. In other words, knowledge is connected not just to language, but to action. We had a wonderful demonstration of that this morning. For those of you who were here at the beginning of Bob's presentation, we did that little song, Cheche Kole, and you notice the gestures we were doing in the course of it, and there were gestures this and the other. That's verbo-motor. And the culture, what was it, Ghana? No,
Ghana.
from Ghana, and that would be a traditional way, not just of entertaining, but of tracking your knowledge. And literally, it is a finding the way through, because you are dancing and moving while you are imagining the knowledge that is so important for the culture. And the gestures help you remember. Use begins saying that so much of our knowledge management, at least in those kind of oral cultures, is based on the body. Bodily symmetry. It's no, we still have it. It's no accident. We still remember, we talk about on the one hand, on the other hand. We draw so many of those binary oppositions because we ourselves perceive ourselves as binary. Left and right, sound coming from one ear to the other ear, all of those kinds of things like that. And that's for use of verbal motor kind of thing. And he says we embody our knowledge in that way. The same thing with our language and the sounds of language. And when Ong saw that, I mean, it had an influence on him later when he starts looking at morality and literacy. The second thing that he looks at least chronologically from our point of view, not from his point of view, but is rhetoric. Because in his study of rhetoric, which was part of the study of Ramus, because he saw Ramus as marking a division in the West between educational systems and knowledge based on rhetorical principles into systems based on printed systems. But we begin to simplify this acting out of knowledge. It's no longer the complete verbal motor thing, but we try to use our language in a way that replaces some of those verbal motor techniques. And so it wasn't limited just to presenting information. This idea of rhetoric was a complete educational system. It was a system in which one had to find arguments. One had to locate materials for the presentation. In fact, the ancient Greeks, would talk about topoi, comes into English as topics, maybe other languages as well, literally means places. Where are the places that you look? We're finding our way through some kind of complex something or other. And, there may be lots of ways through it. Nina, could you put that slide up a second? No. And so I just think about a maze. You're in a place and you realize there's more than one way through. You can find your way in different directions. And the rhetoricians, by picking certain places or topics, would say, okay, take this path or take that path. And many times as they would do that, they would find the arguments and arrange them so that the speaker could find the way through, but so that the hearers could also recognize those kind of, in this instance, places that are somewhat imaginative. Now, given that rhetoric tended to be used in three principal places in Greek culture, one was the law courts, second was the public assembly, where they might be debating issues of civic necessity, and the third was in terms of celebrations where you might be praising someone. You would need different ways through the same material. If you were in a law court, you would have to take people through your evidence in a way quite different from if you were simply praising the virtues of a particular individual's service to the city or something like that. Same thing if it was a deliberative assembly, you take your audience through in a different way. And so we begin to get this sense of how do we find our way through these kinds of things. A little after this, Ong begins to look at a different aspect of rhetoric. One of the five canons of rhetoric, of course, is memory. It's not enough to find the arguments, to arrange them, you have to remember them. And how did you do that? You may have heard the story of Simonides, a Greek poet. This is recounted in any number of ancient texts, but in case you haven't, I'll go ahead and tell you. Simonides was hired once to write a poem in praise of a wealthy Athenian. And as he did that, he also included in his poem a dedication to the gods, the twin gods, Castor and Pollux. And that's a kind of standard thing in that era. But so he does his poem and it's entertainment for the banquet, and it goes on and on and on. And when it comes to the end, the patron's supposed to pay him. Well, this rich guy might have been rich and is probably, cutting the books close. He says, well, hold it, you spent half the poem talking about the two gods. I'll pay you half the agreed fee and you collect the rest from the gods. So during the course of the banquet, a message comes to Simonides and they tell him, there are two men asking for you outside the banquet hall. The message for him. So he leaves, and of course he gets there and he can't find anybody, and an earthquake hits and the building collapses. Everybody is killed in the banquet hall, and the bodies are mangled with the weight of the building. But Simonides, as the one survivor, is asked to help identify people. And he had a memory of where people were sitting at the table. And he was able to identify every single person by remembering the place that they were sitting. Finding a way through. You're finding a way through where you have partial information, but he used what he had and found this. He becomes the kind of patron of what are called memory systems. Francis Yates traces the popularity of these memory systems, and they continue well into the 20th century. Sometimes people who do these kind of massive feats of memory are using a memory system like Lynn Kelly in a recent book also talks about similar things in other cultures. It's not just the Greeks who have done this, but she says she can find evidence in Aboriginal groups in her own Australia, as well as in Stonehenge and other places like that. But the idea behind many of these was to get a complex set of information and then imagine a place you know well. So it could be your home, could be a public building, could be a church, could be a football stadium, any place you know really well, and place what you want to remember at different locations in that building. And then when it's time to remember them, you imaginatively walk through the building. You come into the entry hall and that reminds you of what you placed there. And then as you make your way through, you remember all of the fairly complex information. I mean, literally, this is finding a way through. But it works. There are any number of stories of people who use those kinds of systems. One which I do remember when the Jesuit missionaries came from Europe to China, in the very early interaction with the peoples of China and Europe, probably in the 16th century, they used these kind of memory systems, and they so impressed the Chinese that they were invited into the royal court, and they became scholars in the royal court. And so you begin to get a sense of how this can both impress people and work. That's another way of finding our way through things. Now, Ogg spent a lot of his time on Peter Ramus and the way printing begins to change how we manage information. He argues that two things happen with Ramus. One is a change in logic and rethinking logic. The educational system, of course, in the 16th century, coming out of the Middle Ages, was one that was a training in rhetoric and logic. And Ramus wanted to simplify that. Again, I think what we said about in the 16th century, university students were probably a bunch of 13 and 14-year-olds. And they couldn't read all of the classical authors. And so Ramus wanted to simplify the logic. And he has a huge impact of moving away from oral argumentation and dialectic into these kind of diagrams. In fact, if you look at them now, they look an awful lot like some computer flowcharts, where if you get this, you do this. For Ogg, that's the more important thing. It's not the critique of logic, but it's rather this movement towards information management using the external technology of ink on the page. And by moving away from conversation into something printed, Ramus basically invents a new way of managing information, because now it's separate from the human action. It's put on the page, and it stays on the page. Now, Ong does acknowledge that there were other ways of managing information during this time. He mentions almost in passing that the medievals were developing a symbolic logic, so to step away from the specifics into just representing things by symbols, simplifying information management. But then it kind of got sidetracked. The Rames method took over. And so logic kind of stayed undeveloped until the 19th century, the 18th and 19th centuries. But what you have going on now is a separation between the objects of knowledge and how we manipulate them, how we manage them. For Ramus, it was done in those kind of flow charts. The sense of visualism is gradually being reduced because we can put symbols on the page, even if they are words that are symbolized on the page. Ong likes to pay attention to this shift which is going on everywhere, not just in the educational thing, but he's seeing it in what later we'll talk about. And he talks about his orality and literacy moving into literacy from all cultures. The people need to find a way through. They have to figure out where the information is and how to get to it. And then later, how to recover it, how to find it coming back. I don't mean to confuse the translators, but I'm going to drop another example, and it's somewhere else in the paper, and I may have jumped over it. But Jonathan Swift did a parody of this kind of thing, of separating our knowledge from symbols to things. And you may remember the Gulliver's Travels, which was a 17th century thing when he visits Lagoda. He runs into a scholarly academy where scholars wanted to reverse that process. They didn't want to use symbols, words were symbols. And so instead, they came up with a whole method of knowledge and communication where they would have the actual objects they were referring to. And they would carry on their backs these huge sacks. And when they would meet one another and need to talk, they'd reach in the sack and pick out an orange, if they were able to talk about an orange, or reach in the sack and do something else. They didn't want to use any symbolism. Well, get rid of words completely, just go back to the objects. So, I mean, this sort of information management was, people were aware enough of it that they could do a parody and everybody knew what was going on, and was among the philosophers of Swift's time and things like that. So, this is where Ong was sort of, finding his way a little bit in these sorts of things. When he starts working on orality and literacy, one thing he's trying to do is to find his way through this area. Orality and literacy was published in 1982, so it was written in the early 1980s. What we think of as the big breakthroughs in orality and literacy studies, the work of Eric Havelock and others, really was only in the 1970s. Albert Lord, of course, had done some work in the 1920s and had died before he published some of the work, and so Perry published more of his. Perry had died before he published it, thank you. So these things were published later. Use was, again, back in the 20s, that same kind of group, but it was just coming to be known in the 70s. And so what Ong tries to do is to find his way through. And he uses a kind of pathway that probably makes sense to us. Let me just remind you. He starts by grouping things together. Some definition. Some of the researchers and the people who were studying oral cultures. He then looks at characteristics of oral expression and language, the impact of writing on thinking, the use of space and memory techniques, and then finally contemporary explanation. He simply says, here's this complex sort of thing, I'm going to give you a pathway through. I'll walk you through it. Now, he doesn't present a theory of orality at all. In fact, Ong very much disliked even the term theory, even the term system. But he wanted to order the facts. Many of the criticisms, I think, of morality and literacy stem from the fact that people are looking for a theory and they don't find it. So they make their own. And then they criticize that theory as not quite being what it should be. On would have been the last person to say that I'm giving you a theory to help you understand everything about moral cultures. He's just trying to give you kind of a guidebook. Here's how to find your way through this. Now, that sort of a method means that he couldn't really stop. He couldn't say, okay, we're out in this, we're done. But instead, he goes on into the digital world. Looking at educational systems. Always interested in educational systems, how people learn. And part of what we learn is the information we have, and then how we both find our way through it, organize it, find our way out, and tell somebody else about it. He was fascinated by computer systems. And he noticed that part of what you have to do as you get more abstract ways of storing knowledge is to begin to return to hermeneutics. Hermeneutics, of course, aimed for the Greek god Hermes, the interpreter of the gods, but also the guide. Hermes had a role in Greek mythology of a number of different roles that he would take, because the more information becomes abstract, the harder it is for us to find our way through it. In fact, if you think of information stored on the computer, there is no way that any of us could find that information. We need a guide, or I would say a program or a database or something that will lead us through it. But Ong starts thinking about hermeneutics. When you are face to face, there is less need for interpretation, except in the situation that myself and others find ourselves in. Here we are in Brazil. I speak no Portuguese. I need an interpreter. I need a guide. But then when you write something down, we're a step removed. You remember Plato's criticism of writing. It's just lies there on the page, doesn't say anything. I ask it a question, I get no answer. We need an interpreter. And then as we move farther and farther into abstraction, the more interpretation we need. So Ong sees the real challenge of the digital age as the challenge of interpretation, because we are so far away from all of those kinds of things. That happens with education. The educational systems, moving from Ramus and then John Milton, who was a disciple of Ramus, to others, continually try to refine an educational system to handle more information and to manage that information in different ways. It seems to me that media ecology likes to do the same thing, because we're trying to take a big, wide view of not only communication phenomenon, but of all of the phenomenon that makes up our, I'll say, information ecosystem, that makes up our environment, and that requires that we have to look at many parts simultaneously. And we're going to need some kind of interpreter, someone to guide us through that. And so we're always looking for connections and predictions, or, on forbid, even theories, to find our way through. Now, this kind of helped me a little bit. I just finished a project, and if we have our book sharing tomorrow, I have some flyers on the books that are not printed yet, on a book that many of you know about, I've been working on for years, called The Media Ecology of Theology, trying to apply, our media ecology principles to reflection on Christian faith. I'll try to give a couple of examples from that book, which I hope will talk a little bit about finding our way through different kinds of things. For those who may not be up on all of the details, theology is simply a reflection on belief in the Christian tradition. People ask themselves, what do I believe? I want to understand my particular faith, and I've got to give it substance, whether in word or in some other way. So one of the ways I began getting this idea of a way through happened with music. In the Christian tradition, I try to look at different ways people have expressed their belief, and obviously words and preaching and written scriptures and all of those kinds of things. But there's a long tradition of Christian music. Bob, you would be ashamed of me. I know nothing about music. I mean, I'll sing a hymn in church, but I couldn't tell you much about how musicians think or work or anything else. But I am confident of this, that people who use music to reflect on their faith really know what they're doing. I began once with an insight into this. I was at a performance of Benjamin Britten's War Requiem. Benjamin Britten, a British composer, was commissioned to do a requiem for the rededication of Coventry Cathedral. Coventry Cathedral, central England, was destroyed by bombing in the Second World War. And the people chose to leave it in its ruined state. If you visit Coventry, you'll see the remaining walls of that Gothic church. And instead build a new cathedral, which was completed only in the 1960s. So Britten was asked to do a requiem. A requiem is a standard setting within Christian worship, usually used in the celebration at the end of a person's life. It is a combination of mourning for people, a combination of begging God's mercy, and it is a set musical form. Throughout the 18th, 19th centuries, every major composer composed a requiem in different approaches they had taken toward that. And so Britten, as a contemporary composer, was asked to do a requiem. The requiem form typically has a call to worship, an initial hymn, and then the chanting of the prayer for God's mercy from the Greek, Kyrie eleison, God, Lord have mercy. And then there is a long piece called the Dies Irae. Literally, the Latin means day of wrath. It is the marking or a poetic, stemming from the Middle Ages, remembrance of God's judgment. And it's like, you better be afraid because you're going to be called to account for your life. And then after that, we follow the standard places of the Mass, a song to singing God's praise, a Lamb of God, again, asking for mercy. So the requiem has these set pieces. Benjamin Britten writes his requiem by changing the way through it. First, he changes the setting. Normally, you would have a choir and a choir loft, and you would have them performing, maybe accompanied by an organ. Britten has three choirs. There's a women's choir, a men's choir, and a boys' choir. And he places the men's and women's choirs on either side of the sanctuary, or if it's being performed in an auditorium on the stage. Between them, he has a full orchestra. In front of them, he has a chamber orchestra, and he has three soloists. And behind, in the choir loft, he has the voice choir. He uses those voices against each other, and he writes new pieces to go in between the traditional invitation to prayer, Kyrie eleison, Dies Irae, and others. And the pieces that he writes, he sets the poetry of Wilfred Owen, who was a British World War I soldier and poet who died on the last day of the Great War. And this is profoundly moving anti-war poetry. And he sets his requiem in a way to have people meditate on death and war, and makes this part of the prayer of a requiem, which is a prayer for peace. Now, he is creating his own theology, and he creates the theological meaning by changing the path through this musical setting. In fact, he plants a few extra trees in the musical setting, if you think of it as a forest. And he simply invites people by stepping into this world to reflect on their own belief. Can we believe in a merciful God after something like the Second World War? Can we encourage each other to turn away from violence? What's the cost to us? If you imagine yourself in an empty shell of a ruined church. But this is Benjamin Britten's musical theology. And he does it not necessarily by the words of theology, but by changing the way through a set form. want to give you another example, which is a little more fun, and I never imagined this, again, not being a musician. This goes back to the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance period. I don't think anybody does this today, but it's kind of fun. You remember in that early period, musicians created chants, and because a lot of music in liturgical settings was done by chanting prayers and other things like that within the worship service. And originally, the only ways that the monks had to record those was to kind of put markings on the text that they were going to be singing. And they could be markings of emphasis or other things like that. But basically, you learn the chants by hearing them. That was it. And once your lead monk dies, you lose that whole kind of tradition. And so part of what they wanted to do was to come up with a way of recording music and through musical notation. So it could be, in a sense, played back by other musicians. Somebody else could find their way through the way that you had. And people were trying to work this thing out. Some years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, Barry Bliss, as many of us know, did a paper on musical notation and how this was used in the monasteries. And the key invention was, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this, but I think it's a neume, N-E-U-M-E, which was a way of marking a note in relationship to other notes. And this becomes a breakthrough in, showing people how to use music. Composers got very creative with this. So not only could they create a song, but they realized that they could use the musical notation as a way of creating a theological message. So in the monks in Spain were very good at this, especially. And so they used the note in the normal octave sol. In English it would be sol, but sol, of course, in Spanish also means son. And in a theological pun, Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is also the light of the world. So that note represented by sol, these composers use in different liturgical hymns to anchor a theological point. And so when a certain note was played, the musicians would realize it was referring to Christ. And then they would arrange other notes in reference to it. And so just as Christ becomes the sort of set point, and so people could either go up towards heaven by following Christ or go down the other direction, or that they would take other figures, and then there's a whole series of hymns in honor of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and it's putting the two notes together in particular ways. And so as the people are hearing the melody, they're not just hearing the melody, but they're getting a theological kind of counterpoint built into that. Other composers went and they played with the half notes and quarter notes, because quarter notes are filled in solid and the half notes are hollow. And so they use the patterns of light and dark. So this is my finding my way through music. I'm reading all this stuff and saying, wow, this is really interesting stuff. So what the musicians ended up doing was to get musical information connected to theological information. And by guiding the people through the musical information, they taught people the theological information. Now, I'm not watching the time. Do we have time for one more example? Okay, Mike's going to throw something at me. Okay. The other thing that I worked with in the book, and this actually is what started me on this whole project, was church buildings. Church buildings are media ecosystems. A church building uses every kind of communication. I mean, it is use of architecture, and you can imagine some churches, if you will. In fact, why don't you put that one up? Okay. This is an exterior picture of the Brompton Oratory in central London. It was built in the 19th century, and it's supposed to be somewhat along the line of St. Peter's in Rome, which itself is a story because Catholicism had been illegal in Britain until the 1830s and 1840s after the reign of Henry VIII. And so this church was meant to be we're going to just put it in your face. We're building this huge church in the middle, and it's based on St. Peter's, and like, no, we've been around longer than the Anglican Communion. But the churches themselves become not just the architecture as a way of communicating something, but you also find it's a museum. There are paintings, there are stained glass windows, there is an organ with music, there are places where people sit and stand, people move. Everything about communication can be found in a church structure. And part of what you can do is you can follow multiple paths through the church to learn about your own belief. So let's go to the next one. This is the interior of that Brompton Oratory. And it, again, you walk into it and you feel dwarfed. I mean, there's this high ceiling, and that is meant to give you a sense of your place in the cosmos. And it's very much what they call a theological geography. Heaven's up, and earth is below. But you can find your way through in many different ways. As you walk through it, you could begin at the baptistry, which again symbolizes how people enter into the church literally through baptism, but you also walk into the building through that place where people are baptized. And you're reminded of your baptism. There's water there in the back. Or you can look at the paintings along each of those alcoves, and of course the picture doesn't show all of those, covered with paintings about religious scenes. And so it's a complete catechism as you walk through. You find the same in so many of the medieval cathedrals and other things like that. You find sculptures of particular individuals whose lives are supposed to remind you of virtuous living. And then you gradually move your way to the front. There is written text along the top of the arches, so that again, you're finding an instruction as you go through. The great part about this kind of a church is if you're bored by the preaching or anything else, you can always look around and you will be equally well nourished in your faith by just entering into that kind of an environment. And it is a total media ecology environment. There is nothing that doesn't fit together. There is nothing that doesn't reinforce other things. Many times when I take the students to a church, we see it as kind of an empty shell, because if you have to come here when people are worshiping, hear the music and see how people react and interact with each other. Or if there is incense in the place as well, the different kinds of voice that can be used, whether in reading or in chant or in whisper or proclamation. So you get this sense of, okay, I can find my way through hundreds of different ways, and each one of them is a way of managing the information of what I believe. And you never get bored, because there's always something else to do. This is very characteristic of the pre-Reformation churches. Many times in a culture which had some writing, but not many people knew how to write, they would be educated by going into worship. However, in the Reformation in the 16th century, back to the period talked about before, we get one of the revolutions in information management. Ramus proposes not using these complex systems, but instead simplifying things, those binary diagrams on the page, the flowcharts. At the same time, during the Protestant Reformation, this was an educational reformation. Martin Luther was a university professor and wanted people to read the Bible. You need to have nobody between you and God. Just let God's word speak directly to you. Learn to read. You don't need a priest to explain it. You don't need a church decorated to explain things. And so this design affects churches as well. You don't need this kind of an information system in a church, because you have the Bible. You can open the Bible and read the Bible. The group that took this to the greatest extent was the Presbyterian group, and of course they're connected with Puritans, which in the United States we would know as part of the founders of the U.S. But the Puritan government, of course, under Cromwell, ruled in England for a while. So there was this move to simplify everything. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is a Presbyterian church in, again, central London. It's newer because the church itself had been destroyed in the bombing of World War II, but they rebuilt according to the same plan. Notice, there's none of that decoration. There are not a lot of ways to find your way through except take the main aisle and go up and sit down. There are a lot of other theological changes they've made as well. You can see a little bit in the benches, there are Bibles. So people can take the Bible and they're on their own. Other little things that would change, you see a cross in the background as a plain cross. If we, I'm not going to go back to this slide, but if you look at the one from the Catholic Church, the cross is an image of the crucified Jesus on the cross. This movement away from, we don't need the body, we just need the symbol. You also have the same thing going on in the worship space in the front. There is a huge pulpit because the focus is on the word. They also have a table rather than an altar, and that comes down to the difference in Reformation theology about what happens when we recall the Lord's Supper. Is this a recreation of the death of Jesus, or is it a memorial of the supper? Dining room table says memorial, cross says sacrifice. But even in these places, which we kind of know well, at least those who are churchgoers or synagogue attenders or whatever, we know those places, but we still need a hermeneutic. We need a guide. But the building, in some ways, can be a guide. The more we're in those buildings, the less we need a guide. I mean, I notice that when I take students to the churches, they don't really know what's going on. They may have been churchgoers, but they've never really put two and two together, what's happening there. But to teach media ecology, I love just plant them in the church and say, describe as many communication things that's going on as you can. I don't know whether Walter Ong thought much about churches or other things like that. Now that he was a churchman and he was familiar with these kinds of things. But this sense of you got to find your way through things characterizes what he does and what he encourages. I found that helpful when I was trying to do the book of the media ecology of theology. How did people find their way through? I mean, theology typically has the same building blocks. Belief has not changed a lot. But what we do with belief and how we express it, if I'm doing music, if I'm doing art, if I'm doing architecture, if I am doing writing, if I'm doing a theological essay, the form, the media ecology changes, and that changes the way we go through things. So just encourage you to realize what we're trying to do is find our way through. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And while we're in the business of applause, I want to make sure we give some applause to our interpreter translators and to our technical support. Thank you very much.